and can continue on from here. So we'll be having three presentations as part of this panel, and as with the previous panel, they will all run one after the other, and then all the Q&A will be held afterwards. So please write down your questions and hold them until the end. So for the first presenter for this session is Professor Ayman Shabana. He's Associate Research Professor and Director of the Islamic Bioethics Project at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service in Qatar. Before that, he's taught at UCLA, University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and Florida International University. He has his PhD from UCLA and a BA from Al-Azhar. The title of his presentation is Interface Between Law and Science, Legal Construction of Science in Light of Islamic Bioethical Discourse on Genetic and Reproductive Technologies. The second presentation will be by Kamaluddin Ahmed, who's in the final year of a PhD candidacy in Oriental Studies at Oxford University. He is an Islamic bioethics lecturer and a classically trained Islamic scholar. His thesis focuses on the relationship between textual traditions and legal reasoning in the intellectual history of Islamic law in the 3rd century. And the title of his talk, this is different than what I think is in the printed program, is Science Through an Islamic Epistemological Framework, A First Look. And then the final presentation comes from our convener, Dr. Asim Padella, who's run the program, the Initiative on Islam and Medicine, for a number of years. We've been very grateful to support his work, and I've enjoyed spending time with him in a number of different workshops. Dr. Asim is a clinician, health researcher, and bioethicist here at the University of Chicago. He utilizes diverse methodologies from health services research, religious studies, and comparative ethics to examine the encounter of Islam with contemporary biomedicine through the lives of Muslim patients and clinicians in the scholarly writings of Islamic authorities. His work seeks to develop intellectual frameworks through which Islamic theology can engage with contemporary natural and social scientific data. So he is a scholar, a practitioner. He understands how these issues play out on the ground with patients in the clinical setting, and I've learned a great deal from him about these issues and their practical importance. So with that, I will turn the microphone over.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Dr. Murray. And I would like to start by thanking, again, Dr. Asim Padella and Dr. Afifi Alakiti for the invitation to participate in this seminar. It is definitely an honor to be here this morning and share some thoughts about this topic. This presentation builds on an earlier presentation that was given at Oxford last year in the fall. So this is, if you will, the second iteration of the same presentation on the same topic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to offer some observations about the general framework within which this interaction between jurists and biomedical experts takes place, and then I will move on to explore some practical examples to show basically how this interaction, this interface actually happens. So this presentation aims to investigate the characterization of science as in the work of muftis or in the work of legal scholars by exploring some illustrative examples of fatwas on the topic of genetic and reproductive technologies. So when we talk about science in general, of course, this is a very complex term, and that requires a great deal of unpacking depending on the exact sense and meaning that we use, how we use the term, and also the context. And I think it is very important to be aware of the context of the modern period, which in which science emerged and has been consolidated, or its authority has been consolidated as basically the primary source of exact practical and also experimental or empirical knowledge. When we talk about the emergence of modern science, we see that there is a history of relationship with traditional forms of and sources of science, including religion, of course. So surveys of the relationship between religion and science give various approaches, various ways of that interaction, ranging from dialogue to independence and also conflict. When we explore the question of the relationship between religion and science, we have to bear in mind various important aspects, such as these historical debates I just alluded to, and the question of epistemology. For example, the question of the relationship between reason and revelation, how they relate to each other, but also the question of power relationships, especially within the context of the modern Muslim world or Muslim majority countries, including narratives of colonization and decolonization. When we talk about Islam and science, what do we mean? I think there are two main levels that we need to distinguish. At one level, we can explore the relationship between Islam as a religion and science. And here, of course, we have to be aware of the extended and extensive debate on this topic that includes questions of harmony, disharmony, as I was indicating earlier, relationship between reason and revelation, and other important issues. The other level is the relationship between Sharia law and science. And here again, we have to be aware of another important debate between law and science. How law or legal systems in general, being religious or otherwise, integrate, accommodate, and incorporate modern science or modern scientific facts or techniques. So Islamic bioethical discourses, as we heard this morning, have been dominated for the most part by the juristic frame. And this is not just an abstract or a theoretical kind of proposition, but this is also emphasized and confirmed by empirical work in Muslim majority countries, where we see that the most important resource that both healthcare providers but also users, patients, resort to is usually Islamic law, Sharia law, in most prominently in the form of fatwas. So we encounter terminology of permissibility and impermissibility and legal rules, and also this is reflected in the methodology, where we see for the most part Islamic law, both furu' and also usul, is very much present and represented and utilized. And as I indicated, also the fatwa literature. So bioethics in this sense emerged as a very important area and domain that proves the continued relevance of Sharia, if not as a legal system, then definitely as a moral system, a general moral framework that Muslims appeal to and resort to in order to resolve the question that they have when it comes to modern bioethical questions. So the presentation and the paper basically aims to explore some important questions such as the ones indicated here. But for the most part, the main question here is this interaction, as I said, between law and Islamic law and science, but also juristic authority, if you will, and scientific authority. So to what extent does science aid or challenge the normative authority of Sharia? But also the paper and the presentation aims to point out the extent to which these questions are new. So how pre-modern jurists also explored questions such as these. So a quick survey of Islamic bioethical responses and discourses would reveal greater sensitivity towards modern scientific knowledge. For the most part, science or scientific knowledge has been incorporated, has been accepted by Muslim jurists and Muslim muftis, if you will. Of course, that of course requires a great deal of explanation on how that actually happens. But what I wanted to emphasize from the beginning is that contrary to some general perceptions, the representatives of Sharia or Sharia discourses are not in principle antithetical to modern science or modern scientific information or technology. So here, for example, I refer to a discussion by the former Mufti of Egypt, Ali Jum'a, when he was talking about the importance of ijtihad, the importance of renewing the legal discourses, and in order to enable the legal tradition, the legal system, Islamic legal system, that is, in order to cope with modern challenges, that is, modern technical challenges, but also in other fields as well. And here he refers to 5 main, what he calls worlds, awalim. And the first one, most significantly for our purposes, is the world of things, alam al-ashya. And he says that this is a world that is the domain of modern science. And for that purpose, a modern mujtahid would be required or expected to develop, familiarity at least with modern science, modern scientific knowledge. There are other worlds, as you could see here, but for our purposes, it was very interesting to see here a mufti basically highlighting the importance of science for the renewal of fiqh or for sharia, and for adjusting it to modern needs and modern questions. In this respect, you see also many jurists and many fuqaha emphasize the notion of fiqh al-waqa. And what they mean by that is basically the emphasis on practical, real questions in the real world, rather than just hypothetical issues or questions. When we reflect on what Ali Jum'a had to say here, we have to distinguish between 2 forms of science. He doesn't actually indicate that, but this is kind of understood. This is my own understanding of what he was describing here. I think he was talking about 2 forms of science. At one level, he was talking about science as a process, as a method, as a framework of discovery and problem solving. And this, I think, is the form of science that he was urging his fellow legal scholars and muftis to basically familiarize themselves with. The other form is science in the sense of particular scientific theses, discoveries, or techniques. And here comes the interesting role of the mufti, that he would basically examine these scientific theses, discoveries, and techniques, and basically analyze them and investigate them in light of the Islamic normative values and principles, and try to come to a determination, for example, on what can be considered acceptable, what cannot be acceptable. These discussions are pretty much present and are reflected in the general body of the fatwa literature, both individual fatwas, but also, more importantly, in what has emerged in the past few decades in the form of collective institutional fatwas. So institutions such as Majami' al-Fiqhiyya in both at the national level, Dar al-Ifta', but also transnational institutions such as Majami' al-Fiqh in Jeddah, in Mecca, and elsewhere. So the presence of science, or the acceptance of science in this juristic discourse, has been observed also by several social scientists. So we see here people referring to that as well. Someone like Shibli Malat in 1996, also a famous anthropologist, Skofgard Petersons, in both in 2 publications at least, in 1997 and 2004, where he makes that interesting observation that muftis, by giving so much attention to science, and by accepting science, they sometimes give the impression that they turn themselves into concerned mustaftis in front of these technical experts. In other words, they defer almost without reservation to the authority of modern science. Other scholars also came up with another way of looking at this particular kind of relationship between technical experts and the muftis, such as Muhammad Ghali, who describes that interaction in the form of, by describing these technical experts as almost co-muftis, that they participate in the process of ifta. In this presentation, I aim to indicate, on the basis of the issues that I explored, that muftis actually serve as ethical gatekeepers. So they serve this ethical gatekeeping function on the basis of various precedents, actually, in the tradition. So in the classical discourses, the classical tradition, you have extensive discussions on the question of technical expertise. So in certain professions, for example, including medicine, but not limited to medicine, there is a range of professions also that you encounter in the literature. So through that ethical gatekeeping function, we get to see that these muftis do not basically accept all scientific discoveries or theses or even techniques, but basically they determine or they assess what is in line with Sharia and what is not. At the end of the day, the authority to issue a fatwa remains the prerogative, if you will, of the mufti, and this is based on knowledge of scriptural sources, mastery of certain bodies of knowledge within the Islamic normative tradition, commitment to juristic methodology, and established linguistic practice. And also, we get to observe that outsiders' authority to issue fatwas is questioned. So even when these technical experts try or aim to issue fatwas, these fatwas are considered, lacking in authority or suspect at best. So this unofficial ethical gatekeeping function that they offer or they serve works in parallel, depending on the context, with other types of official gatekeeping function, mainly associated with state-affiliated entities. So the question of technical expertise is not new. As I said, there are extensive discussions in the tradition, and they usually go back to some discussions surrounding some passages or scriptural sources or scriptural references, mainly in the Quran, such as فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And it is interesting to see that someone like Muhammad Sayyid Tantawi, again the late Mufti of Egypt, he gives this interesting explanation of Ahlul Dhikr, and he indicates that includes basically experts in all fields. So here we can see, when we look at the area, the general area of genetic and reproductive technologies, and looking at some examples, we see that in some cases scientific knowledge applications are embraced, and the main task here that the muftis undertake is by indicating the scope of application, guidelines on proper integration, specification of relevant conditions and stipulations. Sometimes scientific knowledge or applications are contested, as is the case with through elaboration of areas of conflict, grounds for and justification of conflict, suggestion of legitimate alternatives, and also elaboration of potential impact in any case. So examples of knowledge or applications that have been embraced include revisiting classical ijtihad-based rules, such as the question of the average pregnancy duration. You can see that this estimation has been adjusted mainly according to modern scientific and medical knowledge. So we see that most modern muftis and jurists have, for the most part, accepted scientific findings when it comes to the average pregnancy period, for example. Another example is replacing archaic methods with DNA testing for paternity verification in lieu of physiognomy or qiyafa, for example. Of course, I'm aware that there is extensive discussion on the relationship between, you know, DNA testing and other established forms of establishing paternity, such as firash or acknowledgement or witness testimony. And there are, you know, interesting discussions on how these two fit together. But the point here is that in general, DNA testing is accepted in some cases. Also, other examples include the cases where modern science or modern scientific discoveries or facts or even techniques supplement classical rules and arrangement. For example, medical genetic testing to determine suitability for marriage, for example, is used and even implemented in many countries. Expanding the scope of diseases that justify nullification of marriage, such as AIDS, for example. There are some interesting discussions about that. And another example is fetal sex selection. On the other hand, we have some examples where scientific knowledge or applications have been contested, such as third-party involvement in the reproductive process, gamete donation, and surrogacy arrangements. This is mainly within the Sunni context. I'm aware that there are exceptions, especially within the Shi'i context, where gestational surrogacy, for example, has been accepted. But what's interesting to note here is that within the Sunni context, you see that both the construction of these technologies have been based on, you know, the juristic discourse within the Sunni context, which indicated that these procedures are proscribed or are contested. While in the Shi'i context, because the juristic authority kind of allowed or gave exception, in some cases at least, you see that these procedures are accepted and also practiced in everyday life. So what's interesting to note here is the role and the impact that the muftis played basically on both in both contexts. How much time do I have? 1 minute. Okay. So basically, the remainder of the slides include some further details on the examples that I highlighted here. I can come back to them during the Q&A session if you are interested. But basically, the conclusion that I have is by examining these various examples, we can clearly see that these muftis and jurists serve as I said, ethical gatekeepers. They provide this unofficial, quote unquote, ethical gatekeeping function, both together with, depending on the context, or independently of other procedures or entities that are affiliated with the state. Thank you very much.